Panic doesn't announce itself with screams, it announces itself with movement. The first hour of any collapse is nothing more than reflex. People don't think, they react. Highways jam before anyone understands what they're running from. Supermarkets turn violent as instinct overrides logic. Families retreat to familiar places, believing nostalgia equals safety. This is the mistake that defines the many and separates them from the few. When 99% of the population moves in the same direction, they don't just create chaos, they create a vacuum. And in survival, the vacuum is opportunity. The strategic vacuum forms the moment the crowd abandons the structures built to contain them. Heavy concrete facilities, industrial plants, research towers, multi-level storage complexes, places designed to stay locked, cool, stable, and secure, become empty for the first time in their lifespan. Once the people leave, these structures shift from public space to unclaimed terrain, and unclaimed terrain becomes the most valuable asset in a collapsing world. This vacuum is not metaphorical, it is mechanical. Fewer people means fewer unpredictable variables. Fewer variables means clearer threat vectors. Clearer threat vectors mean easier control of territory. Abandoned structures concentrate defensibility, the same way a funnel concentrates water. What was once a maintenance burden becomes a fortress by subtraction. The crowd will never understand this. Movement feels like control to them, even when movement funnels them directly into kill zones of their own making. Highways with no exits, bridges with no turnaround, shelters already stripped empty. But the survivor who stops for one calm breath, who observes instead of reacts, gains access to the one advantage panic cannot override: choice. The strategic vacuum is the doorway to that choice. It is the brief window where the world resets, where city geometry rewrites itself, where physics overtakes fear. When everyone evacuates, terrain stops belonging to society and starts belonging to the mind that can read its structure. 7 overlooked locations transform instantly during this vacuum, not because they were designed as fortresses, but because abandonment finally reveals the fortress hidden in their architecture. Your objective is not to outrun the crowd. Your objective is to outthink the blueprint they leave behind. Crowd psychology is predictable because fear is predictable. Collapse does not change human nature. It magnifies it. When the first shock hits, people follow the same 4 impulses every time, regardless of country, culture, or cause. This pattern is so consistent, it becomes rule 0. The crowd will always choose the option that feels safe, not the one that is safe. They run from danger even when they don't understand the direction they're running toward. Highways become rivers of stalled metal, trapping thousands in linear kill funnels with no mobility, no cover, and no access to resources. They rush toward visible supplies, supermarkets, pharmacies, gas stations, believing availability equals accessibility. But visibility is the enemy of survival. Anything visible becomes contested, and anything contested becomes lethal. They imitate what others do. One family runs, a neighborhood follows, then an entire district floods into the same exit routes. Fear multiplies by imitation, not information. The crowd mistakes movement for strategy, and in doing so becomes part of its own collapse mechanism. Imitation becomes escalation. Escalation becomes stampede, and stampede becomes paralysis. Then comes the final pattern, the retreat to familiarity. People flee toward childhood homes, cabins, old family properties, or any place that feels safe. But familiarity does not equal fortification. These locations are predictable, exposed, and already known by too many people. What feels emotionally secure becomes structurally fragile. All of these impulses share the same flaw. None of them consider defensibility, choke points, resource loops, structural strength, or long-term sustainability. The crowd thinks in hours because panic destroys the ability to think in weeks. That is why they ignore the locations that actually matter, the ones designed with reinforced concrete, limited access points, industrial-grade utilities, or built-in isolation. Places engineered for pressure, not comfort. Rule 0 reveals the gap between perception and reality. The crowd sees danger where there is none, and safety where danger is absolute. A sudden evacuation exposes this divide. When the masses flee toward predictable places, the true survivor moves toward the overlooked ones. When they fight for what is visible, you secure what is durable. When they crowd the exits, you claim the structures they abandoned. This philosophy becomes the backbone of post-collapse strategy. You do not follow instinct. You do not follow the crowd. You follow the architecture. A location doesn't become a fortress because it looks strong. It becomes a fortress because its structure obeys the hard sciences that govern survival after population collapse. Once evacuation strips a building of people, what's left is raw geometry, physics, airflow, material density, and behavioral patterns. These factors, not aesthetics, determine whether a location becomes a death trap or a defensive stronghold. The first scientific pillar is structural physics. Reinforced concrete, steel framing, narrow corridors, and limited entry points alter the math of intrusion. A narrow access funnel reduces attacker advantage by compressing numbers. A reinforced wall stops small caliber threats and slows larger ones. Height elevation extends visibility range, turning distance into reaction time. When the crowd leaves, these structural features detach from their intended purpose and transform into defensive asymmetries. The second pillar is crowd-avoidant architecture. Humans naturally avoid unfamiliar industrial environments, dark storage floors, mechanical rooms, utility basements, lab towers, archives, maintenance zones. These locations feel wrong to the average person, which is why they become perfect after evacuation. The physiology of fear pushes people toward open, familiar, brightly lit spaces. Post-collapse logic pushes you toward the opposite. The third pillar is resource stability. Most civilians chase consumables, food on shelves, water in bottles, medicine in cabinets, but true survival depends on systems, not items. Industrial water filtration, sealed environment rooms, insulated chambers, cold storage, grain tanks, fermentation systems, solar backups. These are long-term loops, not one-time finds. When abandoned, they continue functioning or remain usable because their design tolerates neglect. Sustainability emerges not from luck, but from engineering. The fourth pillar is behavioral geometry. Once people vanish from a building, threat vectors become finite. Every entry becomes predictable. Every hallway becomes a controllable funnel. Every stairwell becomes either an escape line or a trap, depending on its shape. You can map an entire abandoned structure in minutes because human movement no longer distorts the environment. The building becomes static. Static terrain is easier to control than dynamic terrain. The fifth pillar is energy economics. Biology demands calories and water. Engineering dictates how much effort you must spend to obtain them. A good fortress reduces caloric output. Less distance to travel, fewer climbs, fewer fights, fewer unknowns. The ideal post-collapse location conserves more energy than it consumes. Efficiency is not convenience. It is survival mathematics. When these pillars combine, they create a phenomenon unique to collapse. The fortress effect. Ordinary locations, ignored, unremarkable, sometimes even unpleasant, suddenly gain defensive superiority because their structure is no longer diluted by crowds, noise, and constant use. Abandonment reveals their true function. It removes interference and exposes pure mechanical advantage. This is why the 7 locations in the next section become so powerful. Their strength was always present, just hidden by the weight of everyday life. Evacuation doesn't transform them, it unmasks them. What the masses see as emptiness, you must learn to see as opportunity shaped by physics, psychology, and infrastructure. A fortress is not built, it is revealed. The moment the city empties, 7 locations undergo the same transformation. They shift from overlooked infrastructure to hardened defensive ecosystems. Their geometry was never meant for civilians. It was meant for weight, pressure, storage, research, or industrial stability. Once the human layer disappears, their true utility surfaces. Each of these 7 places becomes a fortress, not because it welcomes you, but because it rejects everyone else. The first type is the multi-level storage complex, monolithic, silent, and built from reinforced concrete strong enough to withstand decades of neglect. Its defensive power comes from structure, not aesthetics. Narrow corridors create choke funnels that neutralize numbers. Steel roll-up doors form tiered fallback lines. Each floor becomes its own containment zone. The crowd ignores these places because they look empty, but emptiness is the foundation of control. In the vacuum phase, a storage complex becomes a fortress that defends itself by architecture alone. The second is the craft brewery, or fermentation facility, an industrial ecosystem disguised as a small business. Most survivors overlook it because they think beer, not infrastructure. But breweries contain industrial water filtration, stainless steel tanks that double as reservoirs and ballistic cover, and thousands of kilograms of grain, calorie-dense, long-lasting, and easy to store. Fermentation gives you antiseptic alcohol, fuel, and trade value. When abandoned, a brewery becomes a self-contained resource node with walls thick enough to mute sound and limit intrusion. The third is the University Science Tower, especially buildings dedicated to astronomy, meteorology, engineering, or physics. These structures are vertical fortresses, limited entrances, deep core stairwells, concrete framing, and rooftop platforms with line of sight stretching 10 to 20 kilometers. Their generators, labs, antenna arrays, and backup power systems form a natural intelligence hub. When the city empties, these towers become the highest valued observation points and the most defensible high ground positions left standing. The fourth is the HVAC and refrigeration service warehouse, a fortress hiding in plain sight. People overlook it because they expect tools, not defense. But its value lies in extraction capability. Copper tubing, compressors, industrial wiring, pressure tanks, metalworking tools, and insulated chambers give you the ability to repair, build, reinforce, and modify. The walls are often concrete, the doors industrial steel. It is not glamorous, but it is powerful because it enables adaptation. A rare commodity once collapsed stabilizes into scarcity. The fifth is the document archive vault, often found in real estate companies, legal centers, or corporate storage sites, built with fireproof concrete walls 15-30 centimeters thick, sealed doors, climate-controlled air loops, and minimal access points. These rooms are designed to resist destruction. Their greatest advantage is psychological. No one expects valuable survival infrastructure to be hidden inside a file room. Invisibility becomes its armor. The vault serves as the perfect last resort retreat when external threats escalate. The sixth is the industrial utility substation building, not the transformers themselves, but the hardened control structures attached to them. These buildings are small, dense, reinforced, and built to resist tampering. They sit at remote nodes surrounded by clear lines of sight and often fenced off. When empty, they become defensible micro-fortresses with unparalleled visibility. Their isolation is their protection. Their construction is their shield. The seventh and final fortress type is the water treatment microfacility, the smallest but most strategically lethal location on this list. These structures contain filtration tanks, chemical treatment systems, pressure rooms, and hardened valve access. With the crowd gone, the facility becomes a hydration monopoly. Water is the first resource to dictate collapse outcomes, and a treatment site gives you a long-term loop the crowd cannot replicate. It is a fortress not by walls but by necessity. Control water and you control survival. What unites these 7 locations is not comfort or aesthetics. It is asymmetry. Each one gives a single survivor or a small group the defensive leverage of a much larger force. Each one contains built-in advantages the crowd never noticed because civilization blinded them to utility. Evacuation removes that blindness. The city's true fortresses were never the police stations or armories, the obvious targets that draw conflict. The real fortresses were always the quiet structures, the industrial bones of society, the places too unglamorous to attract attention and too specialized for the masses to understand. Once the population vanishes, these structures stand alone, waiting for the first person who recognizes what they truly are. The moment a city empties, its threats don't disappear, they reorganize. Evacuation doesn't dissolve competition, it concentrates it. This is the phase called territorial convergence, when every capable group, scavenger band, or lone operator begins hunting for the same thing: defensible positions with existing infrastructure. The 7 fortress locations you've just learned about don't remain unclaimed for long. Once the initial panic fades, they become gravitational points in the new landscape of survival. Human groups behave with predictable aggression once the vacuum stabilizes. Small groups move first, quiet, mobile, opportunistic. They aren't looking for conflict, they're looking for insulation from it. Their strength lies in speed and silence, which means they'll test abandoned structures before anyone else. They scout entrances, count choke points, and gauge how much effort it would take to secure or breach the location. These groups rarely hold territory for long, they lack numbers, but they identify the valuable positions that larger groups will eventually fight over. Medium-sized groups follow a different logic. They move slower, but they move with intention. Their behavior is shaped by scarcity math. More people equals more mouths, more noise, more risk. To compensate, they seek places that multiply their defensive power. A brewery's steel tanks become barricades. A science tower becomes a watch point. A storage complex becomes a layered fallback system. These groups don't just settle, they occupy. They establish early dominance by taking space, projecting visibility, and controlling approaches. Once they fortify, removing them becomes increasingly dangerous. But the greatest threat in this phase is the organized group, the ones with structure, hierarchy, or pre-collapse training. They do not follow instinct, they follow doctrine. They move when reconnaissance confirms the absence of resistance. They adapt their strategy to the architecture they encounter. They know how to breach, how to funnel, how to starve out defenders. When they enter the picture, every fortress becomes a contested asset. To them, a science tower is not a shelter. It is an intelligence hub. A water facility is not hydration. It is command over regions. A vault room is not safety. It is a final fallback they will claim by force if necessary. You must also consider the non-human convergence. Dogs revert to pack behavior. Scavenging species grow bold without human noise. Environmental hazards, gas leaks, stagnant water, structural fatigue expand into the empty spaces people once maintained. These threats do not negotiate and do not retreat. They occupy the cracks of civilization the moment the crowd abandons them. This entire phase functions under one brutal truth. A fortress attracts what it can protect. The more strategic the location, the more likely it becomes a goal for someone stronger, more desperate, or more organized than you. This is the dark logic the crowd never understands. Safety is not permanent. Safety is contested. Any position with value becomes a battleground once the vacuum narrows and the population fragments into predators, opportunists, and settlers. To survive territorial convergence, you must think beyond possession. You must understand influence, visibility lines, perimeter conditions, the movement patterns of other groups, and the timeline of when each type of threat emerges. Fortresses stop being structures and start being signals. Holding a fortress means you are declaring your presence to every hunter still operating in the region. This phase separates those who hide from those who endure. The ones who cling to a fortress as if it guarantees survival will lose it. The ones who treat it as a temporary advantage, a node, not a home, will outlast the convergence and control the rhythm of movement. A fortress is leverage, not destination. In the post-collapse world, everyone is hunting leverage. Securing a fortress after collapse isn't about heroism or aggression. It's about procedure. The crowd loses because they act emotionally. You win because you act operationally. Once you identify a defensible structure inside the strategic vacuum, you don't claim it. You neutralize it, map it, and stabilize it according to hard logic. Occupation is meaningless without control, and control only exists when the environment bends to your rules instead of its own inertia. The first protocol is approach discipline. You never walk straight in. You observe from a distance long enough to understand rhythm, wind movement, metallic echoes, vibration carried through concrete, patterns of animals, any sign that another human has already begun probing the structure. You approach low, slow, and silent, never revealing your outline against reflective surfaces. Panic survivors make noise with every footstep. Operators make noise only when necessary. Once at the perimeter, you establish entrance control. Every fortress location has 3 categories of access: primary, secondary, and hidden. Primary entrances are usually the worst. They are predictable and memorable. Secondary entrances offer more tactical control. Hidden entrances, maintenance doors, utility shafts, loading bays, stairwell hatches are the true leverage points. Before stepping inside, you must mark in your mind which access points help you escape and which ones help an attacker enter. You enter only through the route that gives you both visibility and retreat options. Anything else is suicide disguised as curiosity. Inside the structure, you execute the 3-minute scan, a rapid threat assessment loop. Minute 1, static threats, loose wiring, gas leaks, flooded floors, structural instability. Minute 2, dynamic threats, sound signatures, footprints, displaced dust, fresh rust breaks, the absence or presence of airflow. Minute 3, strategic value, water sources, potential fallback rooms, choke points, and vertical control. If the scan fails at any minute, you leave and reassess. Control begins with discipline, not confidence. Once inside, the next step is mapping the grid. Every defensible location has a rhythm, a pattern of hallways, stairwells, chambers, storage bays, shafts, and ventilation routes. You learn its geometry the way a predator learns terrain. The goal is to reduce surprise to zero. You memorize where sound travels, where shadows gather, where an attacker must enter, and where you can disappear if overrun. A fortress is a machine, and you must learn its circuitry. After mapping comes silent fortification. This is not building barricades or hammering boards over doors. Noise is your enemy. True fortification is about altering angles, not materials. A moved cabinet transforms a hallway into a funnel. A rope placed across a stairwell becomes an early warning device. A single piece of pipe wedged under a handle becomes a timed barrier. Small adjustments multiply your control without revealing your presence. Every modification must obey the multiplier rule. One change must serve at least 3 defensive purposes. Then comes resource mapping, the discipline most survivors ignore. You identify water loops, storage zones, any cooling system still functional, any tank that can store liquid, any room that can insulate heat or protect supplies. You categorize them by longevity, short-term, medium-term, and structural term. You do not consume, you inventory. You do not celebrate abundance, you evaluate load-bearing potential. A fortress is not a treasure chest, it is a system. Finally, you initiate threat modeling, the mental simulation of every possible breach vector. You imagine how a small group might enter, how a larger group might pressure, how an organized group might attempt a silent infiltration. You study exterior terrain, angles, cover points, approach lines. You model night versus day, dry weather versus rain, empty streets versus converging groups. Control is not physical. It is predictive. When all protocols are in place, only then does the fortress become yours. Not by ownership, but by operational dominance. You don't occupy the structure. You make it obey. You shape its geometry around your will until every corridor, stairwell, and doorway becomes an extension of your decision-making. A fortress is never yours because you walked inside. It becomes yours because everything inside now moves according to your logic. A fortress feels invincible only to the person who hasn't held one long enough to understand its decay. The truth is simple. A stronghold is not a sanctuary. It's a clock. The moment you occupy it, the timer begins. Every resource inside starts depleting. Every structural advantage begins eroding. Every hidden approach becomes known to someone else. Post-collapse survival is not about claiming a location, it's about understanding how long a location can carry your weight before it collapses beneath you. The first erosion comes from resources. Water loops degrade without maintenance. Grain attracts pests. Chemical filters expire. Refrigeration systems fail when backup power burns out. Even concrete breathes. Humidity, temperature flux, and microfractures begin to undermine integrity the longer the building sits without human upkeep. You may feel safe within thick walls, but walls do not feed you, hydrate you, or fix themselves. A fortress buys time, nothing more. The second erosion is visibility. The longer you occupy a defensible location, the more predictable your rhythms become. Smoke vents, trash disposal patterns, latent noise, nighttime light leaks, worn paths around the perimeter. These are signals, and signals draw hunters. Territorial convergence doesn't stop after week 4. It simply matures. Groups grow smarter, more organized, more desperate. The place you secured quietly becomes a known landmark in their mental maps. What was once hidden becomes expected. The third erosion is psychological strain. Isolation bends the mind. Silence amplifies fear. Every distant thump becomes a threat. Every creak in the steel becomes an omen. Humans are not built to live inside bunkers, no matter how strong the walls are. The same structure that protects you physically can corrode you mentally. The fortress turns into a cage, and the longer you stay, the more your decision-making deteriorates. A survivor who sits still too long becomes prey to his own thoughts, long before he becomes prey to other groups. The fourth erosion is strategic stagnation. A fortress gives you leverage, but leverage becomes weakness when it prevents movement. You stop scouting. You stop adapting. You stop anticipating. You begin defending instead of shaping the environment. In collapse logic, the moment you become stationary, your enemies stop being hypothetical. They begin closing distance. Every fortress becomes a magnet, and magnets pull both opportunity and danger. The final erosion is ownership illusion. No location in a collapsed world is truly yours. If you can take it, someone else can take it. If you can defend it, someone stronger can breach it. Walls don't ensure survival. Mobility does. A fortress protects you only until it attracts someone who wants it more, and someone always will. The long-term strategy is not to cling to a fortress. It is to use it as a node within a wider movement pattern. You create redundancy, a water node, a shelter node, a manufacturing node, a high ground node. You rotate between them, leaving no predictable routine. You survive not by holding one position, but by controlling the rhythm of multiple positions. The fortress is a tool, not a throne. This is the final principle of post-collapse survival. A fortress is strongest on the day you take it, and weakest on the day you believe you can stay inside forever. In the end, survival doesn't belong to the one with the thickest walls. It belongs to the one who understands when to abandon them.